Good evening. My name is Gila Safran Nave, and I'm the head of the Department of Judaic Studies and the Jewish Foundation of Cincinnati chair. The Department of Judaic Studies is proud to present journalist extraordinaire Linda Gradstein this evening. She is our guest. She has been our guest for a couple of days now. We are incredibly fortunate to have her here at UC. As I picked her up from the airport yesterday at 8, we had sunny day. We had, 70 degrees, almost 67. So we demonstrated that actually Cincinnati can have sunny days and warm weather, and now we give her a taste of the other kind of Cincinnati. Ms. Linda Gradstein is bureau chief for the Media Line News Agency. Previously, she served as Jerusalem correspondent for America's National Public Radio, NPR as we know it, for over 20 years. Linda is recipient of international awards for her work, as we all know. We listen to her almost every day. She has awards including the Overseas Press Club Award for her coverage of the assassination of former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. She was part of a team that won the Alfred DuPont Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism for their coverage of the Gulf War. Linda Gradstein holds a BS in Foreign Service and a Master in Arabic Studies from Georgetown University, and was a Knight Fellow in Journalism at Stanford University in 1999. Linda speaks both Hebrew and Arabic fluently and lives with her husband and 4 children in Jerusalem. Without further ado, please welcome our guest, honored guest, Linda Gradstein.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I'm circulating a sign-up sheet. We'd like your names and emails, and we'd be happy to put you on the mailing list for the Media Line. We put out a daily news summary of what's happening with some background and some context, what's happening in the Middle East, and we have links to all of our articles, and of course it's free. And you're more than welcome to sign up, and you can unsubscribe at any time. Before I start, you have to know one thing, and that is the difference between Sunni and Shiite Islam. I'm going to tell a joke. I'm kind of telling you in advance so that you'll know to laugh. So Sunni Islam is the majority Islam. It's the type of Islam that's practiced in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria. Shiite Islam is a smaller version. It's an offshoot of the original Sunni Islam, and the relations between the Sunnis and the Shiites have not always been very good. So God looks down from heaven, this is the joke part, and he decides that he has to fix things in the Middle East. So he calls up to heaven the head of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of Iran, who represents Shiite Islam, Ali Khamenei, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he says, I'm going to give you each one wish, and that's how we're going to solve all the problems in the Middle East. And he turns to Baghdadi and he says, what's your wish? And the head of Islamic State says, you know, God, everything would be fine in the Middle East if you would just get rid of all the Shiites. We, the Sunnis, our Islam is the true Islam, and if you got rid of the Shiites, we'd have nothing to fight about, and there'd be peace in the Middle East. And then he turns to Khamenei of Iran, and he says, and what's your wish? And Khamenei says, you know, God, all of the problems in the Middle East are because of the Sunnis. And I promise you, if you get rid of all the Sunnis, there will be no more conflict in the Middle East. And then he turns to the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, and he says, what's your wish? And Netanyahu, who's known as Bibi, thinks a moment and says, well, if he gets what he wants and he gets what he wants, I'll just have a Diet Coke. Now, what I'd like to do is sort of take you on a whirlwind tour around the Middle East. And I want to focus really on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's really what I came to talk about. But that can't be divorced from what's going on in the broader Middle East. And I think that if we're going to look at any kind of a possible solution, the title of the talk is the cycle of war inevitable? I think we have to get a sense of what's going on in the countries surrounding Israel and Palestine. So the first country that I want to talk about are Lebanon and Syria. Now we're up on Israel's northern border right now. Lebanon is being completely overwhelmed by the refugees from Syria. There are about 4 million people in Lebanon, and they have absorbed more than 1 million refugees from the Syrian conflict. And the infrastructure of the country is simply not able to take it. And they have said that they don't want to, that they really can't absorb any more refugees. And there is concern about what that kind of a refugee population long-term could do to the stability of the country. From Israel's perspective, the greatest threat in Lebanon is Hezbollah, the Shiite militia with which Israel fought a war in 2006. And that war basically ended in a draw. After 34 days, there was a United Nations ceasefire. And since then, the situation between Israel and Hezbollah has been fairly calm. There were 5 nuclear scientists assassinated in Syria over the weekend, and Hezbollah is blaming Israel for that. I personally have absolutely no knowledge whether or not who is really behind it. But there is concern in Israel that Hezbollah, which has 100,000 rockets facing Israel that can basically hit any part of Israel, is preparing for another war. And I spoke recently to an intelligence official who said that when the phone rings in the middle of the night, what he's more concerned about even than Iran is Hezbollah. So there's definitely some nervousness in Israel about Hezbollah. Syria, as you know, has been racked by a civil war for the past 3.5 years. The death toll is well over 200,000. It's probably significantly higher than that. Millions of refugees, as well as internal refugees, people who've been forced to leave their homes. I think people are surprised that the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, has managed to stay in power this long. Excuse me. He's being helped. Hezbollah is fighting on his behalf, and there were several battles that Hezbollah really made the difference between Syria being able to win those battles. Right now, there's no sign that the civil war in Syria is coming anywhere near to an end. I think there's been not enough international involvement in this conflict in terms of and the other problem is that the rebel groups, it's not clear who exactly is leading the rebel groups, who they are, what they're standing for, and so I think that the world has been sort of overwhelmed by what's been going on in the broader Middle East, including in Syria, and there's no sign of that conflict ending. Moving, now we're on Israel's eastern border is Jordan. Jordan is one of the 2 countries that Israel has a peace treaty with, and there were fears that there was some pressure in Jordan from some people to break the peace treaty with Israel. I don't think it'll happen. But when we get back to what's happening in Jerusalem today, that actually has some direct influence on what's going on with the relationship between Israel and Jordan. But in general, the peace, while it's not necessarily a warm peace, there is security cooperation between the 2 countries, and the relations between Israel and Jordan are basically very good. What is between Israel and Jordan, of course, is the West Bank. It's called the West Bank because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River, and that is a piece of land that Israel acquired in 1967 during the war, but did not annex. So unlike East Jerusalem, which I'll get to in a few minutes, the West Bank is administered territory. It's not officially part of Israel, and it's not officially part of Jordan. Many of the Palestinians living in the West Bank have Jordanian citizenship, but many of them don't, and they travel on special travel papers, on a laissez-passer. So that's Jordan. The other big player in this conflict is Egypt. And that's the other country that Israel has a peace treaty with since 1979. And certainly when the government of Hosni Mubarak fell in 2011, there was some concern that the first thing the new Egyptian government would do would be to revoke the peace treaty with Israel. That hasn't happened. Again, it's a very cold peace rather than a warm peace. I've spent some time in Egypt. It's a great country. It's a very interesting country. People are great. And they're in the midst of their own revolution now. And the new government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was the former head of the army, he's still popular, but there's a lot of people who feel like he's not bringing democracy quickly enough to Egypt. So Egypt, by the way, is a country of 85 million people, and 60% of the people are under the age of 20. So it's a very young country, and unemployment is very high. And so they're growing, and the only reason there are not massive riots in the streets are because the prices of basic goods like bread and other things are subsidized. And as soon as you try to take away some of those subsidies, you do have some riots. So the situation in Egypt is also a little bit shaky. Let's now move to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the last few days, as many of you, I'm sure, have seen, how many of you, by the way, have been to Israel? Okay, and how many of you have been to the West Bank? Okay, good. So it just helps me a little bit get a sense of what people know when I mention these things. The situation right now, there has been a lot of tensions. It started actually before the summer, and it's gotten even more intense in the last few days. It started with the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teenagers who were hitchhiking home on a Thursday night in the West Bank. The preferred mode of transportation is hitchhiking. Everybody does it. The bus service is spotty at best, and they were picked up by Hamas, members of Hamas. It's not clear if apparently the kidnapping was not ordered by the Hamas leadership, but they were picked up. They were actually killed that same night, but their bodies were not found for a month. So at the very beginning of July, the bodies were found, and in revenge, extremist Israelis kidnapped a Palestinian youth, Mohammed Abu Khader, and burnt him to death. And it really that set off one kind of wave of rioting between Israelis and Palestinians, and a tremendous amount of anger and tension. Then you had the fighting in Gaza for 7 weeks between Israel and Hamas, in which Hamas fired something like 4,600 rockets at Israel. Israel responded with heavy airstrikes on Gaza and a ground invasion. On the Palestinian side, 1,200 people were killed. It's a matter of debate how many of them were fighters and how many of them were civilians. The best from all of the reports and everything I've read is that about half of them were fighters and half of them were civilians, including hundreds of children. So that, of course, and there was widespread destruction in Gaza, which has not yet even begun to be repaired, mostly because they're fighting over how to ensure that the iron and cement won't be used for rockets in the future. On the Israeli side, there were 67 Israeli soldiers and 5 civilians killed. This is the first conflict in which the Iron Dome missile system was used, which is an anti-missile system, and it was very effective at shooting the rockets that would have landed in populated areas, shooting them out of the sky. And that's why the civilian casualty rate was so low. but it certainly raised the tension, and that too, that conflict, like the conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon, basically ended in a draw. There was a ceasefire that was accepted by both sides, and there's supposed to be talks in Egypt on a more permanent agreement, and those talks have not started. At the same time, I think right now neither Israel nor Hamas wants a broader, widespread conflict. What's happened in the last 10 days is a lot of tensions over access to a site that is holy to both Jews and Muslims. Jews call it the Temple Mount. Muslims call it the Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. For Jews, it is the site of where the first and second temples were. And in fact, those of you who have been to the Western Wall, which is the holiest site in Judaism, is a retaining wall of that original temple. For the Palestinians, it is the site that is holy after Mecca and Medina, and it is from there, it's there that Muhammad went up to heaven. So it is holy to both sides. Now, there was a status quo in place, and this involves Jordan. In 1967, Israel conquered the old city of Jerusalem. And unlike the West Bank and Gaza, which Israel did not annex, Israel annexed East Jerusalem, a unilateral annexation that is not recognized by the international community, and that included the holy places. But what Israel said was, we recognize that this is a Muslim holy place, so we will have overall responsibility for security, but we will let this site be run by the Muslim Waqf, the Muslim religious authorities, and Jordan is the official guardian of the site, and the Waqf is tied to Jordan. And that status quo more or less worked for a long time. Under this status quo, Jews and Christians can visit the site. They are not allowed to pray at the site. And it's happened over the last couple of years, but there's been a movement on the Israeli side saying, wait a minute, we're in control of this site. Why can't Jews pray at this site? And there have been a few activists who've really devoted a lot of time and energy to trying to allow Jewish prayer on this site. And one of those activists is an Israeli-American named Yehuda Glick. And about 10 days ago, there was an evening conference at the Menachem Begin Center, if any of you have been there. And a young Palestinian who works in the restaurant there, at the end of the conference, came out, said to Glick, "Are you Yehuda Glick?" He said yes, and shot him 4 times at point-blank range. Miraculously, he wasn't killed, and in fact, he's awake and talking and apparently is going to be okay. The Palestinian people knew who he was because he was a worker in this restaurant, so they tracked him down to his home in a neighborhood called Abu Tur, and there was a shootout with police, and the Palestinian was killed. That set off riots in Jerusalem that added to the tensions that have already been there. And so what you have today is a situation where there really are a lot of tensions. In the last month, 6 Israelis have been killed in both Jerusalem and 5 in Jerusalem and 1 in the West Bank, and that's more than have been killed in the past 2 years. And at the same time, you've had shootings of Palestinians as well. So the tensions are really running very high. And I think that there's a lot of rhetoric on both sides. So the question is, how do you get beyond the rhetoric? And is there really any chance for a peace deal? Now, polls consistently show that 2/3 of Israelis and 2/3 of Palestinians favor what's called a 2-state solution. Now, what a 2-state solution would mean is an Israeli withdrawal from virtually all of the West Bank and Gaza and the creation of a Palestinian state there. Now, the question of Jerusalem, Palestinians say that East Jerusalem, the part that was annexed in 1967, must be the capital of a future Palestinian state. Israel says East Jerusalem is part of its sovereign capital, and Israel will never withdraw from East Jerusalem. So I'm going to ask us all to sort of put the question of Jerusalem aside, because I think there are all kinds of creative ideas for Jerusalem. For example, I think Jerusalem, you could have a borough system where you have, a Palestinian mayor and an Israeli mayor jointly running the city. You can have, in fact, under the Clinton parameters, and apparently the former Prime Minister of Israel Ehud Olmert, who's about to go to jail for corruption, but won't mention that, he agreed that the Palestinian neighborhoods would be under Palestinian control, the Jewish neighborhoods would be under Israeli control. But let's put aside Jerusalem, and we're talking about an Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. Now, last year, United States Secretary of State John Kerry spent 9 months shuttling back and forth between the two sides and really trying to get a peace process moving, and it got nowhere. Now, the Palestinians say that there are currently, not including Jerusalem, there are about 350,000 Israelis living in various communities, also called settlements, in the West Bank. And in order for there to be a peace deal, all of these people would have to leave. The Israelis say that if you sort of play around with the borders, and if Israel annexes, let's say, 5% of the West Bank and gives the Palestinians an equivalent 5% of land, perhaps near Gaza, that only about 100,000 Israelis would have to leave. That's still a lot. In 2005, then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon made a unilateral decision to withdraw from Gaza. And at that point, there were about 8,000 Jewish settlers living in Gaza, and he decided, and there was a withdrawal. Now, the Palestinians say, the Palestinian Authority, which is run by Mahmoud Abbas, that they were not given an opportunity to coordinate, that Israel just said, we're leaving, and left, and didn't give the Palestinian Authority enough time to prepare. But because of that withdrawal and because of the latest war with Gaza, there's a lot of nervousness in Israel. If Hamas fired rockets that at one point almost hit the airport, to the point that a lot of international carriers stopped flying to Israel for about 36 hours, a lot of Israelis say, how can we take the risk and to have Palestinians in the West Bank potentially armed with rockets or missiles that could hit the airport? From the Palestinian side, they see that the chances of a two-state solution are getting fewer and fewer. They say that Israel, rather than stopping settlement in the West Bank, is increasing settlement in the West Bank. And in fact, even today, 200 homes were approved in the neighborhood of Ramot, which is part of East Jerusalem. So what you have is a situation where there is a will and an interest in having a two-state solution, but a lack of leadership and a sense that neither side is really ready to make the concessions that would be needed. Now, for a two-state solution to work, each side has to make one major concession, which I don't see either of them being willing to do. For the Israelis, it's making some type of concession on East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state. For the Palestinians, it's making a concession on what's called the right of return of Palestinian refugees. In 1948, when the State of Israel was created, about 700,000 Palestinians both fled and were forced to leave their homes, and the Palestinian maintain that they have the right to go back to their homes in Israel. The problem is that the places where they came from, for the most part, don't exist anymore. In the 1940s and 50s, 400 Palestinian villages were destroyed, and there really is no place for them to go back to. Now, the right of return, and Palestinian officials have said to me privately, we understand that we can't have the right of return, but we're not going to give it away until we get involved in negotiations. Don't come to us and ask us to give that up before it even starts. But the right of return would be to Palestine, to the future Palestinian state. Another problem is the divisions among the Palestinians. The West Bank is run by Fatah, which is Mahmoud Abbas, while Gaza, up until recently, and even still really today, is run by Hamas, the Islamist movement, which both Israel and the United States see as a terrorist organization. Now, the two sides have come together in this sort of unity government, but they haven't really been able to function. And just last weekend, there were some attacks on Fatah members in Gaza, and there was a visit that was supposed to happen by the Palestinian cabinet. In the end, they didn't go to Gaza. So Israel, from the side, says, wait a minute, the Palestinians aren't even agreed on their leadership. If we take a chance and withdraw from the West Bank, what kinds of assurances do we have that Hamas won't take over the West Bank? So one of the challenges, I think, for the Palestinians is to be able to really speak with one voice, and that means it's called national reconciliation. That means for the Palestinians to really be able to try to overcome their differences and so that Israel has an address to go to. I think the United States can play an important role in this. I think that the Obama administration right now has a lot of other things on its plate, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so I think there's really a lot of hesitancy to move forward with this. But I think that there's no such thing, there's kind of an illusion on both the Israeli and the Palestinian sides that things can go on the same way. When we look at the current tensions, people talk about, is this a third intifada? Intifada, the word means to shake off. In other words, to shake off or to fight against the Israeli occupation. And in the first intifada was in the end of the 1980s, and that was mostly stone throwing and clashes with Israeli troops. The second intifada, which started in 2000 and lasted until about 2005, was a much more violent intifada. It had to do with suicide bombings and shootings. And there's some question about whether these latest attacks, but which also included there were two attacks in which Palestinians drove their cars onto there's an Israeli light rail that runs throughout the city and killed people, whether it's the beginning of a third intifada. The sense that I get is that it's individuals, it's not an organized movement by anybody, it's individuals who are very angry and very frustrated. The question is, how do you get from where we are today to some sort of an agreement? And, you know, I have sort of different ideas whether you catch me on an optimistic day or on a pessimistic day. On one hand, the outline of an agreement is clear. Israel would have to withdraw from virtually all of the West Bank and Gaza in exchange for a peace treaty with the Palestinians. I don't see it happening yet in the near future. At the same time, apparently in Vietnam, during the peace talks, they argued about the shape of the table for months. And once they finally came together, they were able to work out an agreement. I personally think that an agreement for a two-state solution is in the interests of both Israelis and Palestinians. And I think that there's a certain amount of time, and time is running out. Despite all of the confrontations and all of the tensions, there was a new poll that was published this week. On one hand, half of all Palestinians think a violent confrontation with Israel is imminent, and at the same time, 70% of Palestinians believe that there is a chance for peace. So I would urge the Obama administration not to give up on Israel and on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. I think that there's a certain, they're nervous because every other attempt has failed. But I think that the peace process is kind of like a car. You're either moving forwards or you're moving backwards. And right now it's kind of stalled and neutral, but I don't think that that can last indefinitely. And I think that While I don't think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the root of the broader Middle East conflict, I think a lot of what's happening in the Middle East with Islamic State has absolutely nothing to do with Israel. I do think that trying to really move forward and to find some type of a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that would benefit both the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Obama administration. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. If I can also just ask people to introduce themselves and tell me if they're a student or what they're studying or where they're from. It's always interesting to me to see who comes to these.
I'm Neil Scalacan. I'm a political science student, second year. What kind of actions can the U.S. take to help this conflict?
What kind of actions can the U.S. take to help this conflict? First of all, I think the U.S. has to be involved on the economic side. Part of the situation in the Palestinian, both the West Bank and Gaza, in Gaza there's something like 40% unemployment, and in the West Bank it's between 25 and 30%. So the first thing the United States can do is to sort of help build economic opportunities. And I think that if you have a population that has a better economic situation, that'll help. Beyond that, I think the United States has to be involved in really pushing both sides to come to an agreement. And that means sending Secretary of State Kerry again and really making it, the United States can play a very important role. It's the only country that really is seen as an honest broker by both sides. And I would urge the United States to start another round of diplomacy. I know President Abbas is meeting Secretary Kerry this week in Amman and Jordan, I think tomorrow. And I think that perhaps the United States should come out with its own peace plan. There's been some talk about that. And while I don't think you can pressure both sides, I think you can certainly encourage both sides. And to say to both sides that this is something that's very important for the United States.
Hi, I'm Eric Marr. I'm out of biology. It's been a long-standing conflict. Lots of Secretaries of States we can discount maybe the newest ones just not to get into politics, but has there been someone that's been more successful, and are there any lessons to be learned from that?
Well, the truth is that the Oslo Peace Accord in 1993 was the parties themselves. When the Israelis and the Palestinians kind of said to themselves that they will sign an agreement. And we just celebrated the 19th, or not celebrated, marked the 19th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by an extremist Jew. And I often wonder what would have happened if Rabin had not been assassinated. He had a rapport with Yasser Arafat. He was a general, for those of you who don't know him. I think on one hand, the parties have to come to it themselves, and there's nothing you can do. On the other hand, I think perhaps the United States can provide all kinds of incentives for the parties to come to it. I actually see a crisis of leadership on both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, because you have to really be able to bring your population along. And I think there's a sense on both sides of kind of, we can manage this crisis. It can stay like this long term. And I think that's kind of short-term thinking. I don't think it can stay like this long term. I don't think it's a static kind of conflict. So whether, what can the United States, following up on your question, I mean, it's really hard to know. On the other hand, right now there are no negotiations going on. There's basically a vacuum, and into a vacuum is where you can have violence kind of rushing in. And if we look at what's happening now, where the fighting is focused on this holy site, the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, that really has a lot of potential to become more violent, because up until now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a national conflict, and you can solve national conflicts. You can come to an agreement. Once it becomes a religious conflict and the primary emphasis becomes religious and it becomes a Jewish-Muslim conflict, I think that has the potential to be much more incendiary. So I think sort of the time to stop back is now.
Hi, Linda.
Hi.
This is Rich Harknett from the Department of Political Science. So I thought it was fascinating that you started us off with the external strategic environment. And so I want to draw you out a little bit more on that, right? So if we look at the potential for support for whatever might occur in terms of a two-state solution, we typically tick off Jordan, Egypt, right, as being critical to supporting that process, and some sort of stability or solution set, at least in Syria, right? And so all three of those things are in play, in part because of the Syrian civil war, and in part this broader, where your joke started us off, right, with the Sunni-Shia civil war, if you will. One direct question. So the United States has decided to get involved in a civil war in which we don't want either side to win. Right? How does that particular dynamic of U.S. involvement now in the Syrian conflict play out with regard to the Palestinian-Israeli? Is it just sheer distraction and therefore that's your vacuum? But and again, I mean, this is a sort of a dangerous play when you're impacting things on the ground when you don't want either side to win. I'm just curious about how you think that
I mean,
plays
also Israel doesn't want either side to win, I think. You know, there's this sense of, and there's certainly concern about what would happen if Assad was overthrown. And you would have a potential power vacuum in Syria, which is on the border with Israel, and what could happen there. And I do think there's a lot of distraction. I mean, you've got American troops still in Afghanistan. You've got the United States launching a series of air raids on Islamic State. You've got Israel, you've got the United States getting involved in the Syrian conflict. But I think it would be a mistake to say, well, with all that going on, we'll have to sort of just wait and see what happens with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because I think it won't stay the way that it is. And we've seen in the past that it has the potential to explode. And I think that, unfortunately, there really is a crisis of leadership. I don't see the people on either side. But the other thing that I see happening is that there's almost no connection between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground, even in places where they live together, like Jerusalem. Things are separated. It's like the two peoples are on two trains or on two separate tracks, and they have almost nothing to do with each other. But I think that it's dangerous. It's really an illusion to say, well, everything will work out, and we shouldn't get involved because there's just too much going on. I think the United States, as unfortunately the world's policeman, that's what the United States is. And I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has the potential of drawing in and sort of making all of the other conflicts worse. So I think that even with everything else, the United States does have to get involved.
Department?
Sure. Amir Samargandi, journalism major. You mentioned Palestinians needing a unified voice. Do you think Israelis have the same unified voice?
Well, that's a very good question. Do Israelis have a unified voice? But, you know, Israelis have a democratically elected government. So the assumption is that any, first of all, that any peace deal would be put to a referendum. Both the Israelis, and in fact, Abbas has said the same thing when Israel has challenged him and said, well, you know, you only speak for half the Palestinians, you don't speak for the Palestinians in Gaza, and he has said that he would bring anything to a referendum. So I think Israelis do have a unified voice because there is a democratically elected government and there is a Knesset. So therefore, you could have, if there was a peace deal, the Israeli leadership has said it would be brought to a referendum, and I think there would be a majority for it.
State your name and department.
Hi, my name is Rami. I'm a Palestinian from Jerusalem.
Hi, Rami.
Hi. So you touched a little bit on the Summers Gaza conflict. And to be honest with you, if I'm an outsider listening to just your description of it, I would think it was just a 50-day kind of just battle between two giant forces, which is clearly not the case. So just give me your opinion on the massacre that occurred, and just to touch on that, how does that affect the peace process? And to add the apartheid wall that runs across the country, how does that help with the two-state solution or the peace process at all? Thank you.
Okay, first, I don't know that I'd use the word massacre. We could disagree about that. We can talk about it afterwards. I think language is really important, and I try to be as sort of neutral in the language as I can. The conflict in Gaza, I think, to me, what it showed is the futility of any future conflict. In other words, Israel is a military power. It can certainly dominate Gaza if it wants to. But what it says to me is that there is no military solution. That if there's no military solution, then the only solution has to be a political solution, and that means negotiations. And I think that the conflict in Gaza was one more example of the fact that eventually there are two peoples who are sharing this very small piece of land that's smaller than New Jersey, and that will have to try to figure out a way to either share it or to split it. One of my colleagues, a guy named Ehud Ja'ari on Israel Television, said that Israelis and Palestinians are trying to get a divorce, but it's a divorce in which you are doomed to share your bedroom with your ex-spouse for all eternity. I mean, I think Israelis and Palestinians are fated to be together. When you talk about the wall, what Rami's referring to is a barrier that Israel has been building over the past 10 years or so. It runs in and around the West Bank, and part of it is a concrete wall, part of it is a fence. In the populated areas, for example, in the middle of Bethlehem, it's a wall. And it, in effect, annexes about 8% of the West Bank to Israel. And Palestinians that I've spoken to say that they don't necessarily object to the barrier, but they want it to be built on what's called the Green Line or the 67 borders. Israel started building this barrier at the height of the Second Intifada, which to stop infiltrations from the West Bank into Israel. And since it's been built, the number of suicide bombings has gone down dramatically. Now, I personally think that has more to do with security cooperation between the Israeli and Palestinian security services and a decision by Hamas not to carry out suicide bombings. At the same time, it has made Israelis feel safer. Most Israelis support the barrier. I like the word barrier rather than apartheid wall. Israelis call it a security fence. Here's one of your examples of language, right? Is it a security fence? Is it an apartheid wall? And that's why I use the controversial barrier that Israel is building in and around the West Bank. It's a little bit clunky, but I think it's real. And I think when we use, we really have to be careful on both sides about incendiary language. And I think if we're going to talk about journalism for a moment, language creates reality. And so I think we really have to be really careful what kind of language we use. Do we use terrorist? Do we use militant? I personally use gunman. right? Is somebody who attacks Israeli soldiers a terrorist? Is someone who attacks Israeli civilians a terrorist? How do you, I think we have to be very careful, and I think journalists, like everybody else, have a certain role in trying not to use incendiary language that'll just make the conflict even worse.
Hello, my name is Florine. So I wanted to first extend a thank you to come to Cincinnati, come to our university. It's nice that you opened up your schedule to come here.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
I wanted to ask you a follow-up question on the fact that you gave about the 60% is under the age of 20, is that correct?
In Egypt, yes.
Oh, in Egypt. What about in the Palestinian?
I don't have the figure. Palestinians are also are relatively young. I would say, I don't know if it's 60%, it might be 50%. It's, again, Palestinians are also young.
So my question would be in the area of education. Are there institutions of learning that they have access to? I know there's universities that are world-renowned in Israel, but I would like you to comment on their ability to access education at those critical milestones in their lives.
There are several universities in the West Bank, and some of them are very good. Birzeit University is a very good university. Nablus University, An-Najah. In fact, the current prime minister of Palestine was the came from academia and was the president of An-Najah University. Bethlehem University. In fact, there's the largest proportion of PhDs of anybody in the Arab world is among Palestinians. So they really do have access to education. The problem is that there are many, for example, PhD graduates who don't have access to appropriate employment afterwards, whether it's teaching positions or high tech. There is a small Palestinian high tech sector. It needs to grow significantly, but there's some very interesting things going on. So in terms of access to education, they do. In Gaza, it's a little bit more complicated. There are several universities in Gaza, Al-Azhar and the Islamic University in Gaza, but the problem with Gaza is access in and out of the Gaza Strip. Right now, there are 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza, another about 2.2, 2.3 in the West Bank. And in Gaza, the only two ways to get out of Gaza are either through Israel, which has basically blocked the crossing except for humanitarian cases, and through Egypt, which has also blocked the crossing. So people in Gaza are really kind of, and the poverty rate in Gaza is very high. There's about 1 million people who are dependent on United Nations aid. Most of them are refugees. So I think that there has to be sort of a new economic horizon for Gaza. But in terms of access to education, it is there.
State your name and your college.
My name is Justin Levy. I'm engaged to a librarian faculty member. So I'm just curious about Mahmoud Abbas sort of going to the UN, seeking international recognition for the state of Palestine. And I think it was Sweden who recognized Palestine as a country. I know France, I think, is voting on that soon. The sense that I get from Israeli news is that it's been kind of dismissive of that. And I guess I'm just curious if that is in any way going to push the necessity for an agreement at all, or if that is to be dismissed.
I think that's a very good question. I mean, Israel has always maintained that it has to, the creation of a Palestinian state has to be in a bilateral negotiations process. But basically, the creation of a Palestinian state is happening in the international community. What that will translate into on the ground is still not clear. But in 2012, the United Nations recognized Palestine as a non-member observer state. That's equivalent to the status of the Vatican. And now you have Sweden recognizing it, the British Parliament, France. So I think there's sort of two possibilities, and I honestly don't know which way it's going to go. On one hand, it could be that Israel will say, well, this just proves that we can't move forward with peace, that they're not interested in a negotiated solution, they're just interested in going to the international community. The other option is that Israel will say, well, they're going to the international community, it's sort of happening with or without us, we might as well try to join in. But I do think that there has been a change in the way Israel is viewed in the international community. And there's much more criticism of Israel. There's much more pressure on Israel. Certainly in Europe, I think the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is gaining ground in Europe. And I think the Israeli government until now has been a little bit dismissive and has been said, well, it's not important. I think it is important, and I think it's the international community is sending a certain signal. Whether or not that signal will be received by Israel, I honestly don't know.
My name is David. I'm studying international affairs, Judaic studies, and anthropology. And I'm listening to all the points that you brought about Hezbollah, the Gaza Strip, the Temple Mount. They have a war with a state that isn't a state, which means they got fighting people, which means that a war can happen at any given time. A fight could go down at any given time. What is the actual solution? You say politically, that's one side. Religiously, that's another side. So you got the Temple Mount ready to explode, assassination by activists. But what happens if that goes down? What is it that Israel is going to do? And what is it that either Palestinians and them are going to do if that happens? What is the solution to stop either from erupting, which could cause a blowout on every side?
Well, I think, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it clear that he does not intend to change the status quo on the Temple Mount. I think that if Israel decided to change the status quo and in fact to allow Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, that would, exactly what you say, that could really spark something. I think Israel I just came yesterday, and there are thousands of police everywhere you look. Israel has also limited access by Muslims to the Temple Mount. And I think that Netanyahu did send a pretty strong signal, and Netanyahu secretly flew to Jordan and met with King Abdullah and said that they don't intend to change the status quo. That said, I think you're right that it's still very, very tense, and I think it'll take some time for it to kind of calm down. But I think that both Israelis and Palestinians realize that a conflict over the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif has the opportunity could really blow up, exactly as you say, and I don't think that's something that either side wants right now. So I think there really are efforts on both sides to sort of calm it down.
Hi, I'm Jenny Wolfarth. I'm with the Department of Journalism. And my question is about, I know it's a broad question, but how would you describe what it feels like to be covering this conflict as long as you have? Is it exhilarating? Is it exhausting? Is it depressing? I know that it's probably all of those things, but I'm wondering what it feels like to be a journalist on the front line of history with the story that you've been covering for so long. Thank you.
Thank you. It is all of those things. I would say, Israel, Palestine, it's a very small area. So I say that what I like about it is you can cover the war and still be home for dinner. But it's very challenging. It's very emotional. And there are times that it's very intense. I personally think it's a real privilege I think both Israelis and Palestinians are incredibly open. They invite you into their homes. You see people at some of their most vulnerable, and they're willing to share that with you and to let you be part of that. And it's really, I really feel honored to be part of people's lives. It can be very exhausting, both physically, but also it can be very emotional. And especially during times of violence, how do you go into a hospital and see victims of this conflict and then go home and play with your kids? And it's really sometimes very, very difficult. And I remember, this is years ago, I was reading a bedtime story. I don't even remember which kid it was. And my husband was watching the news, and he said, he said, oh, there was a shooting and a Palestinian shot and killed, at least 3 people in Jerusalem, you better go. And my son said, I guess it means you're not going to finish the bedtime story. And I said, I'm not. And so there always is that sort of conflict. But yet, I'm always amazed, and I really so enjoy seeing how people live. And, I'll go into a village in the West Bank not knowing anybody, and I'll be invited into somebody's home and, invited to spend time with them. And I try to keep up with people that I meet and see changes along the way. So I really can't imagine doing anything else. I really enjoy it, although there are times that it's very tiring and and frustrating. Maybe I'll take like 2 more. Yeah, go ahead. 3 more.
I'm John Cohen, and I live in Cincinnati. It seems like, from my vantage point, that Netanyahu has so much pressure from the right that he's not capable of doing what we would hope he might do, and that is do a grand gesture like Sadat had done. Is there any chance that you see that something like that ever happening?
Would Netanyahu do a grand gesture like Sadat, the president of Egypt, who flew to Israel? One quick story about Sadat. This is before I started working, but when he flew to Israel, Israelis thought it was a joke. And when his plane landed, it was surrounded by sharpshooters because they didn't think it was real, and they thought he was going to, come out and blow himself up or something. And they did a poll right before Sadat came, and they said, would you withdraw from the Sinai in exchange for peace with Egypt? And the majority of Israelis said, no way. Sadat came to the Israeli parliament and he said, enough war between us, and they did the poll the next day, and there was overwhelming support for a withdrawal from the Sinai. When it comes to Netanyahu, there are a lot of people who say that it's going to take a right-wing leader to make peace, like Nixon going to China, like Charles de Gaulle to Algeria. The left is already on board with a peace agreement. It's the right that needs to be convinced. Now, I think you're right that there's a lot of pressure from the right in Israel on Netanyahu, and in fact, his coalition is actually one of the most right-leaning coalitions in Israeli history. So is there a chance that he'll do sort of a grand gesture and, come through with a peace agreement? I tend to doubt it. I don't see it happening, but who knows?
Please.
My name is Jim Negerman, and I'm a graduate of UC. I know that the Clinton administration did a lot of extensive, they built an extensive and detailed framework for peace, and I'm wondering if they could build on that now, utilize that now, or if there were other frameworks that would be helpful, and that if they could be employed to, with the current peacemaking efforts, if that could be possible.
So President Clinton in 2000 came forward with what's called the Clinton parameters, and that's still basically the framework that we're talking about. And that's why when we talk about any potential peace deal, everybody kind of knows what the outline is. Nobody knows how to get there. So I actually think the Clinton parameters are still pretty valid, and you're still talking about an Israeli withdrawal from almost all of the West Bank and Gaza, some sort of solution on East Jerusalem, some sort of solution to the refugee issue. And in the past, there's been a fair amount of progress made, certainly on the issue of borders, where there's actually been a map that was drawn, and the Israeli map and the Palestinian map were not actually that far apart from each other. So I think that the Clinton parameters definitely are a very good place to start and to try to move forward from that. But what I'm saying is that right now I just don't, given the broader context of what's going on in the region, I don't really see anything happening, even though I think that what's happening regionally shows even more why there has to be an Israeli-Palestinian solution. But at the same time, it's also made people more nervous about what are the potential for any Israeli withdrawal from territory.
Question, just a reminder that Immediately after the formal session, there will be informal questions and answers, and we'll also have refreshments in the back waiting for you. Also a reminder that the Department of Judaic Studies, the Middle Eastern Studies, European Studies are offering wonderful courses. And I think that this is a very important element, education, really courses on the Middle East studies, history, literature, religious studies, where we can actually have basically enlightenment about what the region is about and how we can go about coexistence, a peaceful coexistence. Last question.
I'm Michelle Vialet from French and European Studies, and there's been a great deal of frustration and irritation between Europe and Israel, and I wanted to ask you to comment upon it and see where you tell us where you think it might go or where it could go.
There has been a lot of tension between Europe and Israel, especially over, Israel sees Europe as siding with the Palestinians rather than siding with Israel. I think many Palestinians see the United States as siding with Israel rather than siding with the Palestinians. So I think there's tension with Europe. At the same time, I think that Israel recognizes that, and Europe is, there's a tremendous amount of trade that goes on between Israel and Europe. And I think that were there to be progress on some sort of a peace deal, a lot of the tensions between Israel and Europe would go away. In the absence of that progress, I think that it's possible that there will be even more tensions. So I think it's something that Israelis are concerned about, but I think it's certainly possible that if there are more countries like Sweden did, like France, that recognize Palestine, Israel sees that as undercutting the chances of a negotiated solution. I don't necessarily see it that way, and I think that it should in some ways be a wake-up call to Israel and saying, look, you're losing the Europeans in terms of support, but it also makes people in Israel a little bit nervous and feel, well, the Europeans don't understand the kinds of pressures that we're living under. I'll just end with one thing. This is Linda Gradstein reporting live from the University of Cincinnati. Thank you.